The American corporal sits across from her in the corner of the canteen tent, his hands folded gently on the wooden table between them. His uniform is clean, his expression kind. When he speaks in halting Japanese, there is genuine warmth in his voice. He has brought her coffee, real coffee, and asks after her health with what seems like authentic concern. But Nurse Hana Tanaka knows what this moment truly is. Beneath the fold of her dress, pressed against her ribs where she can feel its weight with every breath, is a leather-bound medical ledger. Inside its pages are names, codes, a conspiracy that could cost dozens of lives. The American doesn't know she has it. Not yet. But the way he watches her, the careful trajectory of his questions over the past 3 days, tells her that he knows something exists. "So, Nurse Tanaka," he says, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes never leaving hers. "Is there anything you would like to tell me?" This is the moment. The impossible choice. Betray everything she was trained to believe, everything she served, or place her faith in an enemy who has shown her a kindness so profound it has shattered her understanding of the world. How did she arrive here? How did a 28-year-old nurse from Hokkaido end up holding a secret that could change the course of the war, sitting across from an American intelligence officer in a prisoner camp on a devastated Pacific island? To understand that, we must go back 72 hours. Back to the moment when the world ended. The cave smells of death, cordite, and human waste. The darkness is absolute except for the dim glow of a single oil lamp, its flame guttering in the thin, oxygen-starved air. 83 people are crammed into this volcanic hollow on the slopes of Mount Tapachau. Nurses, orderlies, walking wounded, and a handful of civilians who fled here when the American bombardment turned their world into fire and steel. July 7th, 1944. The Battle of Saipan is entering its final, apocalyptic phase. Hana Tanaka sits against the rough stone wall, her nurse's uniform stiff with dried blood. Some hers, most belonging to the countless wounded she has treated over the past 3 weeks. Her hands won't stop shaking. They haven't stopped since the Banzai charge began 12 hours ago. 4,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians, the last organized force on the island, had launched themselves at the American lines in a human wave attack. The sound had been indescribable. A roar of voices, the crack of rifles, the thud of grenades, and underneath it all, the terrible, wet sounds of what happens when flesh meets overwhelming firepower. Now silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums like deep water. Dr. Abe, the senior medical officer, kneels in the center of the cave. His face is gaunt, his eyes hollow. In his hands, he holds 2 grenades. Beside him lies a leather medical ledger, Hana's patient records, the detailed documentation of every soldier and civilian she has treated since arriving on Saipan 3 months ago. "The Emperor's subjects do not surrender," Dr. Abe says, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We are ordered to conduct gyokusai, honorable death. Better to die as proud servants of the Empire than to live as slaves to the American demons." Hana has heard the stories. Every Japanese soldier and civilian on Saipan has heard them, repeated endlessly through military broadcasts and whispered in tents at night. The Americans are oni, demons. They torture prisoners. They mutilate the dead. They commit unspeakable acts upon women. Death, they have been told, is infinitely preferable to capture. The oil lamp flickers. Someone begins to weep. Then a new sound. A terrible mechanical hissing. The cave mouth erupts in liquid fire. The flamethrower's stream illuminates everything in hellish orange light. The Marine behind it is silhouetted like a figure from a nightmare, his flamethrower tank strapped to his back, his face mask reflecting the flames. The heat is instantaneous and overwhelming. People scream. The air itself seems to ignite. "Out! Come out!" The voice is amplified, mechanical, speaking Japanese through some kind of loudspeaker. "You will not be harmed. Come out with your hands visible." Dr. Abe looks at Hana. In that moment, something passes between them, an entire conversation without words. He grabs the ledger, thrusts it into her hands. "Burn them," he whispers urgently. "Whatever happens, burn the records. Do you understand? Burn them all." Before she can respond, before she can even process the weight of what he's just given her, hands are pulling her toward the cave mouth. The wounded are crawling, stumbling, dragging themselves toward the terrible light and the promise of air. The choice to die has been stolen from them by biology, by lungs that demand oxygen, by bodies that flee from fire. Hana emerges into daylight with the ledger clutched against her chest, her eyes streaming from the smoke, her mind a blank slate of terror and confusion. The Marines are waiting. They do not shoot. They point to a clearing where dozens of other prisoners sit in shocked silence, guarded by soldiers who seem almost bored. Hana staggers forward, the ledger still pressed to her body beneath her burned uniform, and collapses onto the volcanic soil. She is alive. Against all expectation, against all propaganda, against everything she was taught to believe, she is alive. But Dr. Abe's final order echoes in her mind. Burn them. Why? What secret could a simple patient ledger contain that was worth dying to protect? What had she carried out of that cave? And more importantly, 3 days later, sitting across from the gentle American corporal with the kind eyes and the careful questions, how does he seem to know that she has it? To understand the shock that was coming, the psychological earthquake that would soon fracture everything Hana Tanaka believed about reality, you must first understand the architecture of her worldview. You must understand the machine that built it. The propaganda apparatus of Imperial Japan in 1944 was not subtle. It was not designed to be. It was a weapon wielded with the same strategic precision as aircraft carriers and artillery, and its target was the human mind. From the moment Japanese forces began losing territory in the Pacific, the military government faced a crisis. Japanese military doctrine held that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Worse than death, a stain not just on the soldier, but on his family for generations. But as American forces began capturing islands and building prisoner camps, a terrifying possibility emerged. What if soldiers and civilians, faced with certain death, chose capture instead? The solution was to make the alternative seem even worse than death. Through newsreels, radio broadcasts, pamphlets, and mandatory military lectures, a single message was hammered into every Japanese mind. Americans were not human. They were oni, demons wearing human skin. The propaganda was specific, graphic, designed to trigger primal terror. Americans would torture prisoners with medical experiments. They would dismember them while alive. They would rape women and murder children. They collected Japanese skulls as trophies. They desecrated the dead. Some of these claims were based on isolated incidents that the propaganda machine exaggerated beyond all proportion. Others were complete fabrications. But the effect was universal. By July 1944, the average Japanese soldier or civilian on Saipan would have genuinely preferred death to capture. Hana had believed every word. The march from Mount Tapachau to Camp Susup took 6 hours. It should have taken 2, but the landscape had been transformed into something from a fevered dream. The central valley of Saipan, once lush with sugarcane fields and small villages, now resembled the surface of a dead planet. Shell craters overlapped like pockmarks, some 20 feet deep and filled with stagnant, rust-colored water. The sugarcane had been reduced to charred stubble. The villages were simply gone, erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed. And the bodies. The thousands of bodies. The Banzai charge had broken against American lines like a human wave against a concrete seawall. The dead lay in heaps, some still clutching broken rifles, others tangled together in groups where they had fallen. American burial details were already at work, but the scope of the carnage was overwhelming. Bulldozers had been brought up. The sound of their engines mixed with the calls of seabirds that had begun to arrive, drawn by the smell. Hana walked in the center of a column of 47 prisoners, nurses, orderlies, and civilians. They were guarded by a platoon of Marines who looked like they hadn't slept in days. But they were efficient, professional, almost mechanical in their movements. That was the first crack in Hana's worldview, though she didn't recognize it yet. These Marines didn't behave like the demons of propaganda. They didn't mock or torment. When an elderly civilian stumbled and fell, a Marine helped him up, not roughly, but with a strange, impersonal courtesy. When a nurse collapsed from heat exhaustion, they called for a medic who administered water and checked her vital signs with the same clinical detachment Hana herself would have used. It was confusing. Worse than confusing, it was disorienting, like gravity pulling in the wrong direction. Specialist Roy Ito walked beside the column. He was Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American, wearing a U.S. Army uniform with translator insignia. His Japanese was perfect, better than some of the prisoners. He called out periodic announcements. "You are being taken to Camp Susup. You will be given medical treatment, food, and shelter. You will not be harmed if you follow instructions." The presence of a Japanese face in American uniform was perhaps the most psychologically disturbing element of all. It violated fundamental categories. The propaganda had never prepared them for this. Hana kept her arms wrapped around her torso, feeling the outline of the ledger beneath the spare shirt a Marine had given her. She hadn't opened it. She was terrified to open it. Dr. Abe's urgency, his final order to destroy it, suggested it contained something far beyond routine medical records. But she also couldn't destroy it. Not yet. Some instinct told her she might need whatever information it contained, if not to protect herself, then perhaps to protect others. Camp Susup sprawled across the southwestern edge of the island, a hastily constructed city of canvas tents surrounded by barbed wire. By the time Hana's group arrived, the camp already held over 7,000 Japanese prisoners, soldiers, civilians, entire families. It was the largest collection of Japanese POWs captured in any battle of the Pacific War to that date. The processing was mechanical. Names recorded. Brief medical examinations. Assignment to tent barracks separated by gender and civilian versus military status. The nurses were housed together in a tent that held 20 women, sleeping on cots with clean blankets. Clean blankets. That was the second crack in the worldview. The first night was psychological torture of a different kind. They waited. They waited for the brutality to begin, for the guards to arrive with their terrible intentions, for the screaming to start from the other tents. But the guards stayed outside. The night passed in silence, broken only by the sound of distant generators and the occasional call of a sentry. Morning brought a breakfast of rice balls and canned fish, delivered by Nisei soldiers who spoke politely and treated the prisoners with the same impersonal courtesy the Marines had shown. Days passed. The horror did not arrive. Instead, something worse happened. Confusion metastasized into profound psychological dissonance. The prisoners were trapped in a cage built not of barbed wire, but of shattered expectations. They had been prepared for death, for torture, for the fulfillment of the propaganda's promises. What they weren't prepared for was this strange, orderly limbo where they were fed and sheltered and largely ignored. On the fourth day, Specialist Ito appeared at their tent with an announcement. "You will be taken to the camp canteen for a meal. Bring nothing. Follow the guards. You are not in danger." The women exchanged glances. The canteen was something they had heard about, a central facility where American soldiers ate. Why were they being taken there? One of the older nurses whispered what they were all thinking. "This is it. This is where it happens." They formed a column and marched through the camp. Around them, other prisoners went about strange routines. Children playing, families sitting together, men doing light labor. An entire society in captivity, seemingly operating under its own quiet logic. The canteen tent loomed ahead, massive and olive green. Hana felt the ledger against her ribs. Her heart hammered. Whatever was about to happen, she knew with terrible certainty that the moment of revelation had arrived. The guards pulled back the tent flaps, and Hana Tanaka stepped into a new world. The smell hit her first. Rice. Not the thin, watery gruel they had been eating for weeks before the battle, but real rice, short grain, perfectly steamed, in quantities that seemed impossible. And beneath that, other scents layering upon each other like a symphony. Fresh bread, canned fruit, coffee brewing somewhere in the back, the savory aroma of some kind of stew or soup. The visual impact followed a split second later. The canteen tent was vast, easily capable of holding 300 people. Long tables stretched in parallel rows, and at the far end, behind a serving counter that ran the entire width of the tent, was something that Hana's mind initially refused to process as real. Food. Mountains of food. Industrial-sized pots of rice. Stacked crates of canned goods with labels in English. Baskets of fresh bread that must have been baked that morning. Cartons of what looked like fruit. And American soldiers, dozens of them, moving through the space with metal trays, serving themselves, eating casually, as if this abundance was the most normal thing in the world. Specialist Ito stood at the entrance, his expression carefully neutral. "This is the camp canteen," he said in Japanese. "All internees are entitled to eat here. There is no cost. Take a tray. Serve yourself. Eat what you need. No cost." The words seemed to arrive from another language, one where the sounds matched Japanese, but the meanings had been scrambled. The nurses stood frozen in the entrance. Hana watched one of the American soldiers glance over, notice their hesitation, and go back to his meal without a second thought. He was eating the same food, from the same pots, at the same tables. "Go on," Ito said, gesturing toward the stacks of metal trays. "Please." The first woman to move was Keiko, a young nurse from Tokyo who had always been braver than her slight frame suggested. She picked up a tray with trembling hands. The rest followed, moving like people in a dream where the rules of reality had been suspended. Hana took a tray. The metal was cool and solid in her hands. She approached the serving counter, where a bored-looking American cook gestured at the rice with his serving spoon. "Plenty more," he said in English. He didn't smile. He didn't sneer. He ladled a massive portion of rice onto her tray with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had served thousands of meals and would serve thousands more. The next station offered canned peaches. The one after that, some kind of meat stew. Then bread. Then a cup of water, so clear it could have been from a mountain stream. Hana found herself at a table, staring at more food than she had seen in a month. Around her, the other nurses did the same. One woman was crying silently, tears dropping into her rice. No one ate. The logic was obvious, wasn't it? This was the final cruelty. The food was poisoned, or drugged, or this was some kind of test, and eating would trigger the punishment they had been waiting for. Or perhaps this was a mind game, a way to make them lower their guard before. An American soldier sat down at the table next to theirs. He was young, maybe 20, with a sunburned face and a tattoo of an anchor on his forearm. He shoveled rice into his mouth with the efficient disinterest of a man who had eaten this exact meal 100 times before. He glanced at the frozen nurses, shrugged, and went back to eating. Keiko was the first to taste the rice. She lifted a tiny amount to her lips, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the spoon. She chewed slowly, waiting for the burn of poison or the metallic taste of drugs. She swallowed. Nothing happened. She took another bite, and another. And then she began to eat with desperate speed, as if afraid the food would disappear. And soon all the nurses were eating, some crying, some laughing, some eating in grim silence. Hana ate slowly, mechanically, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Every bite was a hammer blow against the structure of everything she believed. If the Americans were demons, why this? Why feed them? Why feed them the exact same food their own soldiers ate? Why allow them to eat until they were full when they could have given them just enough to survive? The propaganda machine had failed to account for this. It had prepared her for torture, for cruelty, for every imaginable horror. It had not prepared her for kindness. And that lack of preparation was causing something inside her mind to buckle and crack like a building whose foundation had been pulled away. Later, sitting in a quiet corner of the tent while the other nurses talked in hushed, confused voices, Hana finally allowed herself to think about the ledger. She had disobeyed Dr. Abe's order. She had kept it instead of burning it. At the time, she had told herself it was because she feared getting caught with fire, or because she was too traumatized to think clearly. But now, sitting with her hands wrapped around a cup of real coffee, hot, bitter, impossibly precious, she admitted the truth to herself. She had wanted to know what was in it. The ledger was still hidden beneath her clothes, pressed against her ribs. She waited until the other nurses had finished eating and moved to a different section of the tent. Then, with her heart pounding, she opened it. The first pages were exactly what she expected. Patient records. Names, injuries, treatments administered, outcomes. Her own handwriting documenting the steady stream of wounded that had flowed through the field hospital in the months before the American invasion. There was nothing unusual here, nothing that would require destruction. But as she turned the pages, something caught her eye. Tiny script in the margins. So small she had to hold the page close to her face to read it. Not medical notes. Something else entirely. Sergeant Oda, Type 94, confirmed. Captain Yamashita, Nambu pistol, radio parts, civilian clothing, cache location. Chelan Kanoa basement, 3rd building from harbor. Corporal Higa, radio contact established, frequency 4820, Kempitai informant. Page after page, hidden in the margins beside routine patient notes, a parallel record. Names she recognized. Soldiers she had treated. But beside their names, codes. Equipment lists. Locations. Radio frequencies. The word Kempitai appeared multiple times. The military police, the Empire's intelligence service. Hana's hands began to shake so badly, she nearly dropped the ledger. This wasn't a patient record. Or rather, it was a patient record that served as cover for something else entirely. Dr. Abe hadn't been just a medical officer. He had been using the field hospital as a cover for intelligence work. These were stay-behind agents. Soldiers designated to hide among the civilian population when the island fell, to wait and to strike and to report back to Japanese command. This was a clandestine network, a conspiracy, a secret operation to continue the fight even after the battle was lost. And Dr. Abe had entrusted it to her. The full weight of her situation crashed down on her like a collapsing building. She was holding evidence of a military intelligence operation in the middle of an American prison camp. If it was discovered, she could be executed as a spy. If she destroyed it, she would fulfill Dr. Abe's final order, protecting men who were planning to continue killing Americans, and probably Okinawan civilians who got in the way. But if she revealed it, that thought stopped her cold. Reveal it to whom? To the Americans? To the same people she had been taught to see as demons? The same people who had just given her more food than she could eat and asked for nothing in return? What was the right choice? What was the honorable choice? What was the choice a loyal Japanese subject should make? Hana closed the ledger carefully and pressed it back against her ribs. She felt a sudden, desperate need for guidance, for someone to tell her what to do. But Dr. Abe was dead. She was alone with this terrible knowledge. She sat in that corner for a long time, holding her empty coffee cup, watching American soldiers and Japanese prisoners share the same space without violence. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet voice began to ask a question that felt like treason. What if we were lied to about everything? Corporal James Sullivan of the 27th Infantry Division's G2 Intelligence Section arrived at Camp Susup on July 10th. 3 days after the bonsai charge and 72 hours before his quiet interrogation of Nurse Tanaka in the corner of the canteen tent. To look at him, you would see nothing threatening. He was 26 years old, with the kind of open, honest face that suggested Midwestern farm country and church on Sundays. He spoke Japanese poorly but enthusiastically, apologizing constantly for his grammar mistakes. He smiled easily. He seemed genuinely interested in the well-being of the prisoners. To the nurses in Tent 14, he quickly became a familiar and even welcome presence. He would arrive in the mornings with Specialist Ito, the Nisei translator, ostensibly to check on medical needs and general conditions. But unlike the other military personnel who rotated through the camp with bureaucratic efficiency, Corporal Sullivan always seemed to have time to sit and talk. He asked about their lives before the war. He asked about their families. He wanted to know about nursing training in Japan, about their hometowns, about what they missed most. He spoke to Hana on the second day. "Nurse Tanaka," he said, settling onto the ground outside her tent with his notebook balanced on his knee. "May I ask you some questions? Nothing sensitive. We're just trying to understand who we have in the camp, to make sure we're meeting everyone's needs." His Japanese was truly terrible. He mixed up verb tenses and used the wrong particles constantly. It would have been almost charming if Hana hadn't been acutely aware of the ledger hidden in her bedroll 3 feet away. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "You were a nurse. That's skilled work. How long did you train?" 3 years. In Sapporo. Sapporo. His face lit up as if she had said something delightful. "I read about Sapporo. The snow festival, yes? Very beautiful city." He wrote something in his notebook. His handwriting was neat, methodical. "And you came to Saipan when?" "April of this year. To work at the field hospital. That must have been difficult. War is especially hard on medical personnel. You see the worst of everything." His voice carried what seemed like genuine sympathy. "Did you have a large staff?" Many doctors. Several doctors. Many nurses. The wounded. There were many wounded. He nodded sympathetically, wrote more notes. The senior medical officer was Dr. Abe, yes? Other prisoners mentioned him. He was respected. The question was casual, almost throwaway. But Hana felt something cold move down her spine. Yes, Dr. Abe was very dedicated. A good doctor? The best. Sullivan smiled. I'm sure he appreciated having skilled nurses like you. In my experience, good doctors and good nurses develop a strong working relationship. They trust each other with important things. He moved on to other topics. What was her family doing back in Japan? Did she have siblings? What had she hoped to do after the war? The conversation lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When it ended, Sullivan bowed politely, a gesture he clearly didn't perform naturally but had learned for this work, and moved on to talk with other nurses. Hana sat very still, watching him go. That question about Dr. Abe, the way he had phrased it. Trust each other with important things. Was she being paranoid? Was the guilt of carrying the ledger making her see threats where none existed? Over the next 2 days, Sullivan became a fixture in the camp. He was everywhere, talking to soldiers, sitting with families, always with that same gentle, interested demeanor. He brought toys for the children. He helped an elderly woman find better shade for her tent. He requisitioned additional medical supplies when one of the nurses mentioned they were running low on bandages. He was so kind, so genuinely, disarmingly kind. And every day, he found a reason to talk to Hana. The conversations seemed random, scattered. He asked about her work in Hokkaido before the war. He asked about the journey to Saipan. He asked about the battle, but only in the most general terms, careful not to push into territory that might be traumatic. But looking back, Hana would realize that every conversation had included at least one question about Dr. Abe. Dr. Abe sounds like he was a remarkable man. Did he have other responsibilities beyond treating patients? In a field hospital, everyone does a bit of everything, I imagine. Did Dr. Abe ever ask you to help with administrative tasks? Record keeping. It must be difficult, not having your medical records. I know hospitals usually keep detailed logs. Were you able to save any documentation when you evacuated? The questions were always gentle, always wrapped in concern or casual interest. And always, Hana felt the weight of the ledger like a stone in her chest. She began to understand that she was being hunted, not with violence, not with threats, but with patience and psychology and the careful building of what felt like trust. The free canteen, the medical care, the kindness to children. All of it was real, she thought. The Americans genuinely seemed committed to humane treatment of prisoners. But that didn't mean there wasn't also a parallel game being played. These were not mutually exclusive truths. On the evening of July 12th, Corporal Sullivan asked Hana if she would join him for a conversation in the canteen. Nothing formal, he said, smiling that Midwestern smile. But it's quieter there in the evening. We can talk more comfortably. Hana knew this was the moment. Whatever was coming, it was about to arrive. She followed him to the canteen tent. Most of the serving stations were closed for the evening, but one corner remained open, a small area with coffee and simple food. Sullivan brought 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her at a wooden table in the quietest section of the tent. For a few minutes, they talked about nothing. The weather, the improvements being made to the camp, whether the food was adequate. Then Sullivan set down his coffee cup and looked at her with those steady, kind eyes. Nurse Tanaka, I want to be honest with you about something. I've been a military intelligence analyst for 2 years. Before that, I was a schoolteacher in Wisconsin. I mention this because I want you to understand that I'm not trying to trick you or frighten you. That's not my job, and it's not who I am. Hana's heart was hammering. She kept her face carefully neutral. I've been reviewing prisoner statements and trying to understand the organization of Japanese forces on Saipan before the battle. Particularly, I'm interested in understanding what plans might have been made for continuing operations after the island's fall. He said it so gently, so respectfully, as if he were asking about her preference for tea. Many nations employ stay-behind networks when territory is lost. It's standard military practice. The Japanese military is highly professional, so I would expect them to have contingency plans. That's just good strategy. He paused, took a sip of coffee. Now, Dr. Abe was clearly a skilled physician. But we've heard from other prisoners that he also had, let's say, other duties. Responsibilities beyond medicine. This isn't unusual. In wartime, talented officers often serve multiple roles. Hana said nothing. She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. Sullivan continued, his voice never losing its gentle, conversational tone. I've also learned that Dr. Abe was very organized, meticulous with records, and that he had an exceptional head nurse who he trusted completely. A nurse who would have been present during the treatment of hundreds of soldiers. A nurse who might have been entrusted with important records. He leaned back slightly, his hands still wrapped around his coffee cup. Here's what I believe, Nurse Tanaka. I believe Dr. Abe was involved in planning for post-battle operations. I believe he kept detailed records, because that's what professional officers do. And I believe that a resourceful, intelligent nurse like yourself might have saved those records when you left the field hospital, thinking they could be important. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Sullivan's expression remained kind, but there was something else in his eyes now. A quiet certainty. He knew. He didn't have proof, but he knew. So, Nurse Tanaka, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Is there anything you would like to tell me? In that moment, Hana understood the full architecture of what had been done to her. The free canteen, the medical care, the kindness to children. All of it was genuine. The Americans truly were committed to humane treatment. Their military policy demanded it, and from what she had observed, most of them seemed to genuinely believe in it. But that humanitarian impulse was also a weapon. It was a psychological operation of extraordinary sophistication. By treating prisoners with dignity and basic humanity, the Americans created an environment where the foundation of Japanese propaganda, that Americans were monsters, crumbled under the weight of observable reality. And when that foundation crumbled, so did the loyalty that had been built upon it. The prisoners at Camp Susup weren't being tortured into compliance. They were being confronted with cognitive dissonance so profound that their entire worldview was disintegrating. And in that state of mental collapse, they became vulnerable to exactly the kind of gentle interrogation that Corporal Sullivan was conducting now. It wasn't just humanity. It was strategy. Corporal Sullivan wasn't just a kind man who cared about prisoners' welfare. He was an inquisitor, perhaps the most effective kind, the one who dismantles your resistance not with pain, but with the quiet weight of an impossible moral choice. Hana sat across from him, feeling the ledger against her ribs, and realized she was facing the same decision she had been wrestling with for 3 days. Protect the secrets of the army she had served, the army that had lied to her about everything, or place her trust in an enemy who had shown her unexpected humanity. The choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the fates of dozens of men whose names were written in tiny script in the margins of a medical ledger. What happened next is not recorded in any official document. Corporal Sullivan's intelligence reports from Camp Susup contain no mention of a medical ledger, no dramatic confession, no interrogation breakthrough. The official record suggests that information about Japanese stay-behind networks on Saipan came from multiple prisoner sources over the course of several weeks. But history is rarely as dramatic as we want it to be. Real moral choices are often made in silence, and their consequences ripple outward in ways that leave few traces in official archives. What we can say with reasonable certainty is this. Nurse Hana Tanaka remained at Camp Susup for 3 months. She worked in the camp medical station, treating prisoners and occasionally assisting with the American medical staff who rotated through. She was noted by her supervisors as being cooperative and skilled. And approximately 2 weeks after her conversation with Corporal Sullivan, during a routine tent inspection, an American soldier found a leather-bound medical ledger tucked beneath Hana's bedroll. It appeared to have been placed there recently, not hidden with any particular care, almost as if someone had wanted it to be found. The ledger was passed to G2 intelligence. Within 48 hours, American forces had detained 14 Japanese soldiers and civilians who had been living in the ruins of Chelan Kanoa and Garapan, equipped with cached weapons, radios, and orders to conduct sabotage operations. A planned attack on the American supply depot was prevented. Several Okinawan civilians who had been threatened into providing support were released. It's impossible to know how many lives were saved by that intelligence. Dozens, certainly. Perhaps hundreds, when you account for both American servicemen and Okinawan civilians who would have been caught in the crossfire of those planned attacks. Hana Tanaka never spoke publicly about the ledger or how it came to be found. In the historical record, she is simply one of thousands of Japanese prisoners processed through Camp Susup in the summer of 1944. But in the vast machinery of war, in the calculation of victories and defeats, this quiet act of agency, this choice made by one nurse in impossible circumstances mattered. To understand why this story matters beyond one woman's choice, we must zoom out from Camp Susup and look at the larger strategic picture of 1944. The American military government's policy of humane treatment for prisoners was not an accident. It was a carefully designed strategy, developed by the Civil Affairs Division and implemented across the Pacific Theater with specific objectives. The logic was straightforward. If the Allies could demonstrate that surrender was not equivalent to the horrors promised by Japanese propaganda, they could encourage mass surrenders and potentially save thousands of lives on both sides. Before Saipan, Japanese military forces surrendered at a rate of less than 1%. It was virtually unheard of. Entire garrisons would fight to the last man, and civilians would commit mass suicide rather than face capture. But at Saipan, something unprecedented happened. By the end of the battle, over 14,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians had surrendered or been captured alive. This represented roughly 30% of the total Japanese presence on the island, a percentage that would have been unthinkable in any previous Pacific battle. The free canteen at Camp Susup was just one visible element of a broader psychological operation. Medical care was provided at the same standard given to American troops. Families were kept together when possible. Religious practices were respected. Children were given schooling. The camps were run with discipline, but without cruelty. Word of this treatment spread. In subsequent battles, at Tinian at Peleliu, and most significantly at Okinawa, surrender rates continued to climb. At Okinawa in 1945, over 10,000 Japanese military personnel surrendered, along with tens of thousands of civilians who chose American custody over the mass suicide urged by Japanese forces. This represented a fundamental shift in the psychology of the Pacific War. The propaganda machine that had promised death before dishonor began to lose its grip when confronted with the observable reality that surrender did not mean torture and death. How many lives were saved by this strategy? The question is impossible to answer with precision, but military historians have estimated that the policy of humane treatment and active psychological operations against Japanese propaganda prevented tens of thousands of deaths. Both Allied servicemen who would have faced fanatical resistance, and Japanese soldiers and civilians who would have died in futile last stands or mass suicides. The canteen at Camp Susup was not just about feeding prisoners. It was about breaking the cycle of propaganda and counter-propaganda, of atrocity and retaliation, that had characterized so much of the Pacific War. It was about demonstrating that even in the midst of total war, there could be limits. There could be humanity. And it worked. Not perfectly. Not completely. The Pacific War remained brutal until its end. But at the margins, in places like that canteen tent on Saipan, where a young nurse from Hokkaido sat drinking coffee and wrestling with an impossible choice, the machinery of total war was disrupted by something as simple and radical as basic human decency. History remembers the grand strategies, the massive battles, the decisions made by generals and politicians. The invasion of Saipan is recorded in meticulous detail. The 20,000 American casualties, the 30,000 Japanese dead, the turning point in the Pacific Campaign that brought American bombers within range of Tokyo. But history often forgets the quiet choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The nurse who decided to trust her enemy. The corporal who chose psychology over brutality. The policymakers who understood that humanity could be both a moral imperative and an effective weapon. These are the moments that shape history as much as any battle. They just leave fewer traces in the official record. Nurse Hana Tanaka survived the war. She was repatriated to Japan in 1946, returned to Hokkaido, and resumed her nursing career. She married, had children, and lived until 1987. She rarely spoke about her time on Saipan, and when she did, she never mentioned the ledger. But sometimes, according to her daughter, she would sit quietly and say something that seemed disconnected from any conversation. Even in the darkest times, people can surprise you. That's the thing they never tell you. People can surprise you. Corporal James Sullivan returned to Wisconsin after the war, went back to teaching, and lived a quiet life. His military records note his exceptional work in prisoner interrogation and intelligence gathering, but provide no details. The medical ledger itself has been lost to history. If it still exists, it sits in some archive, misfiled and forgotten, its margins filled with tiny script that once represented life and death choices. But the impact of what happened in that canteen tent rippled outward. The lessons learned at Camp Susup were applied at Okinawa. The policies refined in the Marianas were used in the occupation of Japan. The understanding that psychological operations and humane treatment could be more effective than brutality became part of American military doctrine. And somewhere in that vast machinery of policy and strategy and historical consequence, there was a woman who made a choice, who looked at the world she had been taught to believe in, saw it crack and crumble under the weight of observable reality, and decided to place her trust in the possibility of something better. That choice mattered. It saved lives. It changed the course of events, even if the official histories never recorded her name. Because that's how history actually works. Not in the grand gestures we memorialize in monuments, but in the quiet decisions made by ordinary people who find themselves facing impossible choices and somehow, despite everything, choose humanity. Hana Tanaka faced an impossible choice. Sitting in that canteen with the ledger pressed against her ribs and an American intelligence officer watching her with kind, knowing eyes, she had to decide between loyalty to an empire that had lied to her about everything and trust in an enemy who had shown her unexpected humanity. In her position, what would you have done? Would you protect the secrets of the army you served, knowing that army had filled your mind with propaganda about demons who turned out to serve you coffee? Or would you place your trust in people who treated you with dignity while still being your enemy? Would you prioritize abstract loyalty to a nation or concrete responsibility to prevent further bloodshed? These aren't simple questions. There's no obviously right answer. That's what makes the story so powerful and so relevant. Because throughout history, ordinary people have faced these kinds of impossible moral choices, and their decisions have rippled outward in ways that shaped the world. I'm genuinely curious to read your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Hannah's position? What do you think drove her decision? And what does this story tell us about the complexity of moral choices in wartime? These are the hidden stories of World War II. Not the battles we all know about, not the famous generals and politicians, but the moments of psychological and moral conflict that are often lost to history. The times when ordinary people faced impossible choices and somehow found a way forward. Our mission on this channel is to ensure these stories are preserved and remembered. To dig into the archives and find the nurses, the translators, the intelligence officers, the civilians, the people whose quiet choices mattered just as much as any military strategy, even if their names never made it into the textbooks. If you believe these stories need to be told, if you think history is more than just dates and battles, if you want to understand the human complexity behind the grand narratives we're taught, then subscribe now and join that mission. Because every week, we're bringing you another story like this. Another moment of moral complexity. Another quiet choice that changed the world. Hit that subscribe button. Be part of preserving these stories. And I'll see you in the next video.